She had been dreaming of silver eyes for 237 nights, and she had told no one, not her landlady, who left chamomile tea outside her door each morning and never asked why the curtains stayed drawn until noon. Not the two women from the diner where she worked double shifts who had noted the circles under her eyes, but attributed them to the long hours and the cold Oregon winter pressing against the plate glass windows, and certainly not the council liaison who left messages on her phone every third week, checking in, as they called it, which was the bureaucratic word for monitoring. Mara Ashvale had learned young that the things you kept closest to your chest were the only things that remained truly yours. She had so little left. She was not about to surrender a dream, but the dream was changing. That was the part she had not expected. For the first 7 months it had been static, almost painterly in its stillness, a pair of silver eyes in darkness watching her with an expression she could not name. Not threatening, not soft either, simply present in the way that mountains are present, in the way that deep water is present beneath ice. She would wake with her heartbeat slow and strange, her skin flushed, the mate bond scar on the inside of her left wrist aching with a warmth that felt almost like recognition. Then 3 weeks ago, the dream had given him a voice, low, unhurried, a voice that seemed to move through her rib cage before it reached her ears. He had spoken one word in the old tongue, the pack tongue she had not heard since she was 17 years old, and standing in a courthouse in northern Montana with her mother's signature on a renouncement document. And the word had come apart inside her chest like an ember dropped into dry grass. The word was her name, not the name she used now, the short, quiet human name she wore like a borrowed coat, her true name, the one her grandmother had given her at birth, during the naming ceremony, the one that had been stricken from the blood register when she was cast out, the one that should, by all rights, have been unknowable to any creature who had not been present at her beginning. She had woken that morning with her hand pressed flat against the scar, and something moving beneath the skin, warm and certain, like a compass needle swinging home. She had called in sick for the first time in 3 years. She had sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold and stared at the wall for a long while. Then she had opened her laptop and begun searching, the way she always did when the world tilted and she needed to find her footing on something solid. She searched his name. She searched the Silver Ridge Pack. She searched for news from the Eastern Territories, from the Great Pack Assemblies, from the High Council Cole's quarterly dispatches, which were publicly available in heavily redacted form, if you knew which corner of the internet to find them. What she found made her set the coffee down. The Alpha King was coming to Oregon, not to her town. That was absurd. Her town was 400 people and a 2-pump gas station, and a diner that served the best blackberry pie in the county. Not the sort of place an Alpha King had business being, but to Portland, a 3-hour drive south, for the Autumn Assembly, which was the great gathering of the Western Packs, and which had not been held this far north in 40 years. He would arrive in 2 weeks. He would be there for 5 days. Every unmated wolf in the Western Territories with any standing would attend, every wolf with standing. Mara looked at her wrist. The scar was the pale silver of old moonlight, thin as a seam, running from the inside of her wrist to the first crook of her elbow. It was the only mark the renouncement had left on her body. Everything else the casting out had done, the silencing of her wolf, the severing of the pack link, the stripping of her bloodline designation, had been invisible, internal, architectural, as if someone had gone through the house of her and taken out all the load-bearing walls, and then been surprised when the rooms felt wrong. But the scar remained, and for 237 nights it had been warm. She was not a woman who made impulsive decisions. She had survived the last 12 years by being careful, deliberate, small. She had survived by making herself easy to overlook and difficult to provoke. She had cultivated stillness the way other women cultivated gardens, with patience and without expectation of reward. She closed the laptop. She sat with her hands folded on the table and her eyes fixed on the middle distance. She was 30 years old. She had not run with a pack since she was 17. She had not heard her true name spoken by any living throat since the same year. She had not allowed herself to want anything larger than a warm room and a full pantry, since she had learned the hard way what wanting large things cost. She opened the laptop again. She searched for the assembly registration requirements. Then she made a phone call to a woman named Delia, the only other exile she had ever trusted, who lived 2 states over and owed Mara a favor large enough that neither of them had spoken of it directly in 8 years. "I need a name clearance," Mara said when Delia picked up. "Not mine, a clean one, High Western Territories." A long pause on the other end, the sound of a television being muted. Then Delia, careful and steady. "Mara, what are you doing?" "I'm not sure yet," Mara said honestly, "but I think I have to go." She drove south on a Wednesday, the back seat of her 12-year-old sedan carrying a single bag and a dress she had bought the previous Saturday at the only second-hand shop in town. The dress was a deep, quiet green, the color of forest floors after rain, and it fit her well enough. She had stood in the changing room mirror for a long time, looking at herself with the unfamiliar objectivity of someone who has forgotten, briefly, to make themselves small. She was not the girl who had been cast out. 12 years had made her into something else, something she had not yet named, and the dress was the first garment she had owned since girlhood that seemed to acknowledge this. The dream came for her again that night in the Portland motel room she paid for in cash. But this time the silver eyes were not in darkness. They were in a great hall, and there were hundreds of wolves around them, and the eyes were scanning, searching. The way you search when you know something is there but cannot locate it. And Mara, watching from within the dream, understood for the first time that the dreaming was not one way. It had never been one way. He was searching for her. She woke before dawn, with the scar blazing warm, and the certainty sitting in her sternum like a stone she had swallowed. She lay in the dark and let herself feel it, full a thing she had been refusing to feel for 238 nights, the thing that every careful, cautious year of her rebuilt life had been both protecting and concealing. Her wolf knew, had known perhaps before the dreaming even started, the deep, silenced part of her, the part the renouncement had muffled but not destroyed, which she had understood only gradually and with great care over 12 patient years. That part had oriented toward him as helplessly and precisely as a flower turns toward light, not toward the idea of him, not toward the title or the power or the mythology, toward the specific gravity of a specific soul she had never met, whose silver eyes she had been watching in the dark for 238 nights, whose voice had spoken her true name, her stolen name, from within a dream she had no explanation for. She had not gone looking for a mate. She would not have chosen this, if choosing were the mechanism by which these things worked. She was an exile without standing, without pack, without bloodline designation. She was a woman in a borrowed green dress, with a forged name clearance in her glove compartment, and a scar that had no business being warm. She was the last person who should walk into the autumn assembly and feel the pull she knew, with a certainty that was almost serene, she was going to feel. She got up. She washed her face. She watched herself in the motel bathroom mirror for a long moment, the dark eyes, the set of her jaw, the way she had learned to hold herself as if the things she carried had weight but not dominion over her posture. Then she drove to the assembly. The hall was enormous, a converted event center with high ceilings and warm amber lighting, and it smelled of packed bodies and old magic. and the specific charged electricity of several hundred wolves' proximity, all of them carrying their power in the visible way that wolves in their proper territory carry it, like cloaks they have not thought to remove. Mara moved through the registration and the entry procedures with the clean documents Delia had provided, and the careful anonymity she had spent 12 years perfecting. She found a position near the eastern wall, not hidden, not prominent, just present. A woman at a gathering, a wolf at an assembly. The scar on her wrist was burning. She was not prepared for the moment the doors at the far end of the hall opened. She had thought she would feel the bond as a pull, as a directional sensation, as the compass needle thing she had felt waking from the dream. She had not expected it to land like a physical impact, like stepping off a ledge and discovering the ground was closer than you thought. Every careful, constructed distance of 12 years collapsed simultaneously, and Mara stood at the eastern wall with her hand over her wrist and her breath held very still, and across the length of the great hall, the Alpha King walked in. His name was Calder Voss. She had read that in the dispatches. She had not read what the dispatches could not contain, which was the precise quality of his presence, not large and loud in the way of men who have something to prove, but dense, like a gravitational field, like a place where the air had more substance than elsewhere. He was flanked by his council and his betas, and the various formal retinue of the highest-ranking wolf in the Western Territories. But Mara barely registered any of them. She registered him. Her wolf, which had been silent for 12 years, stirred in her chest like a creature waking from a long sleep, and made a sound she felt rather than heard, low and certain, and nothing like distress. And then, before she could retreat behind her careful stillness, before she could remember herself and her borrowed name and her forged documents, and the 1,000 reasons this was impossible, his silver eyes, the exact silver eyes from 238 nights of dreaming, lifted across the hall and found her. The moment hung between them like a note struck on a still night, and Mara saw, with a clarity that needed no interpretation, the precise instant his wolf knew. His body went very still. The conversation he had been conducting with a beta at his left shoulder stopped mid-sentence. His silver eyes, which had been scanning the room with the habitual awareness of a man in command of every space he entered, were no longer scanning. They had stopped. They had stopped on her. She did not look away. She had promised herself, in the motel room, in the mirror, that whatever came, she would not look away from it. 12 years of smallness was enough. She stood at the eastern wall in her forest green dress, with her wrist warm and her chin level, and she let him look. What she did not do was understand, not yet what was happening in the broad high-ceilinged space behind his eyes. That understanding would come later, in pieces, and it would require her to return, as she so often did when clarity required it, to the beginning. The beginning, for Mara Ashvale, had been 17 years old and a late summer night in northern Montana. Not the courthouse, though the courthouse came after. Before the courthouse there was the ceremony. The coming-of-age ceremony, the one that the Asheville pack had held for 3 unbroken generations on the last full moon of summer, when the second-generation wolves were brought to the Elder Stone at the center of the pack's oldest territory and presented to the moon for recognition of their wolf blood. It was the ceremony that established lineage and gift and the visible shape of what each young wolf carried. It was the ceremony that, in a pack with clear bloodlines, was largely a formality. You were acknowledged, your wolf was seen, you were welcomed into full standing. For Mara it had not been a formality. She had been born to the Ashevale pack's third line, her mother a middle-ranking wolf of modest gift, her father's name not spoken at the naming ceremony, or at any ceremony after it. She had grown up in the comfortable ambiguity that position entailed, not prominent enough to be watched closely, not low-ranking enough to be dismissed. She had been unremarkable in the way that the most dangerous things are sometimes unremarkable, which is to say that the unremarkableness was its own kind of structure, its own kind of concealment, though she had not known this at the time. She had known privately, from the age of 14, that something was different in her, not wrong. She had never had the sense of wrongness, the misalignment that wolves with suppressed gifts sometimes described. The difference felt more like an instrument playing in a register that the surrounding music had not accounted for. Too low for some ears, too resonant. When she stood near the elder stone during the younger children's ceremonies, she felt it hum against her ribs in a way that no one around her seemed to notice. She mentioned this to her mother once, and her mother's face had done something complicated and quickly smoothed, and the subject was not raised again. The night of her own ceremony, she had stood in the full summer dark with the moon overhead, and the elder stone throwing its cold light against the assembled pack, and she had felt, for the first time in her life, the full register of what she was. It came up through her feet from the stone-littered earth, and it moved through her the way tides move, not violently, not with any suddenness, but with an inevitability that had all the gentleness of things that have been true for a long time and are only now being acknowledged. Her wolf rose in answer to it, not the controlled, measured rise that ceremony usually prompted, but something older and larger, something that the pack elder had taken a step back from, and then another step, and then stood with his weathered face gone quiet, and his eyes doing the thing eyes do when a person is seeing something they have prepared for in theory, but not in reality. Her gift was not a common one. It was not the tracking gift, or the healing gift, or the strength augmentation that the Asheville Pack's bloodlines typically produced. Her gift was older than any of those. The pack elder had a name for it in the old tongue that translated, imperfectly, to something like true voice or root speak. The ability to speak directly to the bond magic that underlies all pack structures, to the foundational layer of the mate bond and the blood bind and the pack link themselves. It was a gift that had not appeared in a wolf in the Western Territories in over a century. It was the kind of gift that, in older times, had been the foundation of alpha lineages. She had not known any of this, standing in the summer dark at 17, with the moon on her face, and the elder stone singing beneath her feet. She had felt the enormity of it without understanding its name. The elder had understood. He had not celebrated it. He had looked at her for a long time, and then at the pack alpha, a man named Draven who had held the Asheville pack for 11 years and who had his own reasons. She would later understand, for the expression that moved across his face like a cloud crossing a cold sun. And then the elder had done the thing she had least expected. He had looked away, not symbolically, literally. He had redirected the ceremony, moving to the next young wolf in line, and the moment had been absorbed into the general noise of the gathering. And Mara had stood at the edge of it, the gift still resonating in her chest, and had understood from the elder's averted gaze alone that something had just been decided about her future without her input. She had been right. In the 3 weeks that followed her ceremony, the whisper campaign began. Quiet at first, the kind of social static that is almost indistinguishable from ordinary pack gossip. Questions about her parentage, the absent father's name, the circumstances of her mother's pairing, implication laid over implication, until a narrative formed that had the shape of truth even though it was constructed from selective omissions and deliberate misdirection. By the end of the 3rd week, the story was established. Mara Asheville was not Asheville at all. The gift she had displayed was not a Asheville gift. The bloodline she claimed was not the bloodline she carried. She was an anomaly, a disruption, a possible threat to pack integrity. None of it was true. She would not know the full truth for years, and even then it would come to her in pieces, assembled slowly from sources that had no reason to lie. The full truth was this: her father's name was Aldrich Voss. The Voss bloodline was the oldest of the 4 founding lines of the Western Territories, the bloodline from which the Alpha King's authority descended. The gift she had displayed at the Elder Stone was not an anomaly. It was a homecoming. It was the Voss root speak returning to the line it had always belonged to, surfacing in a daughter whose existence had been hidden specifically because someone in the Ashvale pack had understood, perhaps, before she did, what she was and what she could one day claim. But at 17 she had known none of this. She had known only the withdrawal of warmth, the careful social engineering of her isolation, the way the pack link had felt thinner and thinner in those weeks, as if someone were reducing the signal. And then the Alpha's invitation, which was not an invitation, to attend a formal review of her standing, which had resulted in a renouncement document, which her mother had signed with a hand Mara could still see shaking slightly if she let herself look back at it. The renouncement had stripped her of her blood designation, of her pack link, of her bloodline name. It had muffled her wolf in the way that renouncements did, not cleanly, not permanently, but with a gray dullness that sat over everything like perpetual cloud cover. And it had left the scar on her wrist, which was the one thing the renouncement ceremony could not erase, because it was not, technically, created by anything the Ashvale pack had granted her. It was older than them. It was older than any of the formal pack ceremonies. It was the mark the mate bond leaves on a Voss wolf when the bond awareness first activates, and no renouncement in the world could touch it, because it had not been written by pack authority. She had not known that either at 17. She had thought the scar was a remnant, a wound. She had covered it for years. She had worn long sleeves in summer and avoided the searching eyes of any wolf she encountered in the careful, solitary half-life she constructed for herself in the years after. She had worked. She had learned. She had been in the way of people who have been very badly hurt and have decided that the answer to that is not collapse but construction, extraordinarily deliberate about the life she was building. She had read everything she could find about the mate bond, conducted in the way that exiles without standing conduct research, carefully, obliquely, through human scholarship and second-hand pack histories and the occasional contact with fringe wolves who existed in the same half-world she did. She had assembled a picture of what the scar meant from fragments, the way you reconstruct a broken thing from its pieces. And what the picture told her was this: the mate bond scar on a Voss wolf was the bond acknowledging its counterpart. It was the root speak's way of registering a tether. It marked the location of the match before the wolves themselves met, before the formal recognition, before anything the conscious mind could acknowledge or deny. She had been carrying his mark for 12 years. He had never known she existed, or so she had believed, until the dreaming started, until 238 nights of silver eyes, and the building warmth in the scar, and the voice that had eventually come, saying her name in the old tongue, from the dark of a dream she could not explain. She had tried, in those months, to find a rational explanation for the dreaming. She was not a superstitious woman. She had survived too much to afford superstition. She had considered stress. She had considered the proximity to the 12-year anniversary of the renouncement. She had considered the possibility that her suppressed wolf was manifesting symbolically in her sleep because the long solitude had reached some kind of threshold. She had considered all of these and held them carefully and examined them fairly. None of them accounted for the warmth in the scar. None of them accounted for the old Tong name, the name that no living voice should have been able to speak, the name that had been stricken from the register and should have been, by all structural logic, inaccessible to any wolf who had not been present at her naming. The mate bond spoke through the root speak. The root speak was the Voss gift, her gift, the deep structural magic that moved underneath all pack bonds like groundwater, and the mate bond, once tethered, did not consult the blood register. It did not check standing. It did not require the approval of councils, elders, or the administrative apparatus of pack governance. It simply was. It had been since the moment she was born to the right bloodline, and it would continue to be until one or both of the tethered wolves drew their last breath. This was the thing she had been living inside without naming it. This was the stone she had swallowed. This was what she brought with her into the assembly hall under the amber lights in the forest green dress. With the forged documents in her bag and the impossible warmth of 12 years of unacknowledged belonging burning in the scar on her wrist, Calder Voss looked at her across the hall, and his wolf knew. She could see it happen. She had the root speak. She could feel the bond structure the way other wolves cannot, could feel its activation, the way you feel a door open in a house where you have lived in darkness. She felt it open in him, the sudden, unguarded, animal recognition that bypassed all the formal architecture of his authority, and his title, and his careful governance, and went straight to the oldest layer, the layer where wolves are simply wolves, and the bond is simply the bond. And no human arrangement of hierarchy or politics can alter what the deep magic has already written. His counsel noticed his stillness. She could see the nearest beta turn to him with an expression of professional concern, could see the quiet communication of high-ranking wolves in close quarters, the slight adjustments of posture and attention. Calder Voss did not respond to any of it. He was still looking at her. His face held that particular quality she had come to know from the dreams, present, gravitational, not threatening and not soft, but overlaid now with something rawer, something that had not had time yet to become composed. She did not move toward him. She was not sure she could have moved, but that was secondary. She would not have moved if she could. That was not how this worked. That had never been how this worked. The recognition was his to process. The next step was his to take or decline. She had come because the dreaming had told her to come, because 12 years of careful distance had finally met something it could not be careful around. But she was not here to perform longing. She was here to be found. The assembly had a formal program. There were presentations and acknowledgments, and the various bureaucratic rituals of pack governance that these gatherings existed to conduct. Calder Voss moved through the opening of it with a composure that, to any observer not carrying the root speak, would have appeared entirely normal. He stood at the dais and spoke the formal words of the Alpha King's opening address, and his voice was measured and authoritative, and exactly what the occasion required, and the assembled pack listened with the particular quality of attention that a high wolf commands without effort. Mara listened too. She listened with her whole body, with the root speak humming low in her chest, with the scar blazing, and her wolf pressing against the muffled quiet of 12 years of renouncement with something between urgency and recognition. She stood against the eastern wall, and she listened to the voice from her dreams come out of a living throat and fill a real room, and she kept her hands still at her sides, and her face composed and her breathing steady, and it cost her something, that composure. It cost her considerably. But she had been paying this kind of cost for a long time, and she was practiced at absorbing it without letting it show. After the address, there was the formal mingling period, the social architecture of the assembly, the networking and alliance building, and the various conversations that wolves came long distances to have. Mara remained near the eastern wall, and she watched, and she thought, and she tried to determine what her next move was. She had not determined it when a young woman appeared at her elbow. She was perhaps 22, with the bearing of a high-ranking beta's daughter, and the carefully managed expression of someone running a social errand with professional discretion. "The Alpha King requests a word," she said, pitched low, not a question. Mara looked at her for a moment. Then, quietly, "Where?" She was brought to a side chamber off the main hall, a small room with high windows and the smell of old wood and dust, and the faint, grounding scent of pine resin that seemed to cling to formal pack spaces regardless of their location, as if the old magic had a particular affinity for resin. There was a table with 2 chairs and a water pitcher. The young woman showed Mara in and closed the door behind her. She stood in the middle of the room and waited. He entered 3 minutes later, alone, which was not standard protocol for an Alpha King at a public assembly, and which told her something about the state he was in. The composure she had watched from across the hall was still present. He was too practiced to have shed it entirely, but it sat differently now, worn the way a coat sits on someone who has just come in from the cold, slightly at variance with the warmth of the interior. He was taller than she had calibrated him to be from the hall. His eyes were the exact silver of the dreaming which she had known would be true, and which still landed with a weight she had not fully prepared for. He looked at her, she looked at him. Neither of them spoke. The scar on her wrist was incandescent. "You were at the eastern wall," he said finally. His voice was low, unhurried, the voice from the dreams. "Yes," she said. "For how long?" "Since the doors opened." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that gravitational quality, and she could feel him trying to place her, searching the internal catalog that an Alpha King with his range of contact and responsibility would maintain, the network of names and bloodlines and faces that a man in his position could not afford not to carry. She watched him not find her there, and she watched the fractional adjustment of his expression when he didn't. "I don't know you," he said. It was not accusatory. It was a statement of genuine puzzlement from a man who expected to know every wolf in a room. "No," she agreed. "You don't, but my wolf." He stopped. She had never heard a man of his authority stop himself mid-sentence, and the incompleteness of it was more revelatory than anything he might have finished with. "I know," she said, with a gentleness she had not expected to find in herself for this moment. "What is your name?" he asked, and here it was. Here was the place she had been steering toward, or being steered toward, for 238 nights and 12 years and 30 years of a life shaped by a bloodline secret she had only recently learned to understand fully. She could give him the borrowed name on the forged documents. She could give him the careful alias. She could give him the name she had worn, like that borrowed coat for 12 years of careful, solitary, diligently constructed survival. She reached down, slowly, and pushed back the sleeve of her dress. The scar caught the light from the high windows, pale silver, thin as a seam, running from wrist to inner elbow. She held her arm out, not toward him, not as if suffering, simply made visible what she had covered for 12 years. She heard his breath change. She watched him look from the scar to her face and back to the scar, and she watched the Voss bloodline recognition move through him. Not the mate bond alone, though that too, but the deeper structural recognition, the root speak resonating between bloodlines, the ancient signal that said same source, same line, same foundation. "My name," she said quietly, "is Mara Voss, and your wolf knew my name before you did, because the bond has been tethered for 12 years. I didn't come here to surprise you. I came because the dreaming told me it was time. The silence that followed was long and complete." "The dreaming," he repeated, and his voice had changed. Something had come loose in it. "Silver eyes," she said. "In darkness at first, then, in a hall, searching. You were searching the room. I could see it. You couldn't find me yet, but you were looking. It started 238 nights ago." He was very still. The quality of his stillness was different now from the formal stillness of the dais. This was the stillness of a man encountering something that reorganizes the landscape of everything he has understood. "I've been having the same dream," he said slowly, "since spring." She looked at him steadily. "I know. I didn't know what it was," he said. "I thought." He stopped again. "My beatus thought it was stress, the territory disputes in the south. I thought they were probably right. They were probably providing the most reasonable available explanation," she said. "It wasn't wrong of them." He crossed the room in 2 steps, and she held her ground, not from defiance, not from performance, but because she had promised herself she was done making herself small, and holding ground was the first discipline of that, the most foundational. He stopped 2 feet from her, close enough that she could feel the specific density of his presence without its being a pressure, and he looked at her face with an expression that was entirely unguarded now, and that she was not going to look away from. "Show me the scar again," he said. She held her arm out. He took her wrist in his hand, not gripping, simply holding, the contact so careful it barely registered as weight. He bent his head and looked at the scar for a long time. She could feel the root speak moving between them at the contact, the deep structural magic conducting between 2 wolves of the same foundational line, and she let it. She did not dampen it, or manage it, or channel it in any particular direction. She let it be what it was. It had been suppressed long enough. When he raised his head, his silver eyes were very close. "Voss," he said, her bloodline name spoken in the old way with the weight the name carried. "Yes," she said, "my father was Aldrich Voss. I was born outside the formal line because he and my mother didn't formally pair. The Asheville pack raised me, and then found it convenient to remove me when my gift manifested at the coming-of-age ceremony. They renounced me when I was 17. She said it without inflection, without the performed composure of someone suppressing pain. She said it the way you state geography. Here is the land, here are its features, here is what happened. I've been living as a human adjacent wolf in Oregon for 12 years. The scar appeared 6 months after the renouncement. I didn't understand what it was for several years. He was quiet, absorbing this. She could feel him integrating it, the way a careful mind integrates an unexpected structural shift, checking it against what he knew, adjusting the load-bearing walls. The Asheville pack renounced a Voss bloodline wolf, he said, and his voice had taken on a new quality, something that was not quite cold but had the stillness of cold. They didn't know what I was, she said, not precisely. They knew my gift was anomalous. They may have suspected the bloodline, but the formal record was that I was simply a disruption they were removing. She paused. The alpha at the time is no longer in his position. I checked. I'm not interested in historical grievances. I'm interested in what is. He looked at her for a moment. "You're not angry," he said. "I am," she said simply. "I've simply been angry for long enough that it's become part of my structure rather than a state I'm in. It doesn't need a performance." Something shifted in his face. She watched it shift. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right. The dream has been." He was choosing words with unusual care, this man who spoke from a dais with the ease of long authority. "I understood this spring that something had changed. Not in my territory, not in the politics, not in anything I could point to externally. Something had changed in me. My wolf was— restless is too mild a word. My wolf was oriented, like it had locked onto a bearing and would not release it." He looked at her wrist, at the hand he was still holding. "I told myself it was proximity to the South Territory disputes. I told myself the stress of the arbitration was manifesting in unusual ways. I am, apparently, capable of lying to myself." "You were working with what you had," she said. "You didn't have context for it." "I had the context every Voss wolf is given at coming of age," he said. "The mate bond scar, the root speak activation, the dreaming. I had all of it explained to me. I simply did not recognize it in practice because I had never." He stopped, because I had assumed I would know my mate when I met her, that it would be someone I knew, someone already in my world. Mara looked at him. Instead, she was in Oregon. Instead, she was in Oregon, he agreed, and the careful authority of his voice had something almost wry in it, something genuinely human, and she felt the root speak respond to that quality the way dry ground responds to rain, not dramatically, not with flourish, but with a deep structural opening, an acceptance that was physical before it was emotional. They stood in the small chamber for a long time. The assembly continued in the hall outside. She could hear the murmur of it, the movement and the formal presentations. Neither of them moved toward the door. The renouncement, he said. It would need to be formally revoked, the bloodline designation restored to the register. I'm aware, she said. That's within my authority. As Alpha King, that falled, she said. His given name, the first time I'd spoken it aloud to a living person, he went very still. That's not why I came. I need you to understand that before anything else. I didn't come for the standing, or the name restoration, or the formal reversal of what was done to me. I came because the dreaming told me you were looking, and because 12 years is long enough. She held his gaze, level and unhurried. If you recognize the bond, that's for the bond's reasons, not for administrative ones. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had no previous reference for, and then he said quietly and with great certainty, My wolf knew the moment you walked in. I know, she said. I felt it. Did you feel? He stopped, started again. When the recognition happened, what did it feel like to you? She thought about this honestly. Like coming inside after a very long time in the cold, she said. Like the sound a house makes when it settles, not loud, not a relief exactly. More like acknowledgement, something that had been quietly true becoming audible. He was quiet for a moment then, with a precision that suggested he had been holding the words for some time. Yes, exactly that. She could not have told anyone afterward precisely how the conversation moved from that point. She would remember it in impressions, in the texture of the room, and the specific quality of the afternoon light coming through the high windows, in the root speak, moving steady and warm between two wolves of the same ancient line, finally in the same physical space for the first time. They talked a long time, in the way of people who discover that they have a great deal to say to each other, and equally a great deal to simply be quiet in the presence of. She told him about Oregon, about the diner, and the chamomile tea left outside her door, and the second-hand green dress. He told her about the South Territory disputes, and the particular exhaustion of high authority, and the spring morning he had woken from the first dream of silver eyes and darkness, and spent an hour standing at his window, trying to name what had shifted. Dark eyes in the dream, he said. Dark eyes watching me. Patient, not he thought about it, not waiting for something from me, just watching, as if you already knew what was going to happen. I didn't, she said. I was as disoriented as you were. You seemed very certain, he said. I've learned to look certain, she said. It's a useful skill. The afternoon was moving toward evening when he said, careful and direct, the restoration of your name and standing is within my authority. It doesn't require a council petition. If the Alpha King invokes the Voss bloodline provision, it can be done tonight. I know the provision, she said. She had spent a portion of the previous month reading every codification of Voss bloodline law she could access through the legitimate registries. I'm not refusing it. I'm telling you the order of things matters. The bond first, the name second, not the reverse. He looked at her steadily. The bond first, he repeated. You haven't formally acknowledged it yet, she said. Not to me, not in the old tongue. Your wolf has acknowledged it, and I have felt it, and we have both been inside the dreaming. But the formal acknowledgement is yours to give or withhold. I'm not asking you for it. I'm telling you that when you give it, I will know you gave it for its own reason, and not as preamble to administrative restoration." The room was very quiet. Outside, the assembly continued. Somewhere in the hall, a presentation was concluding. She could hear the formal closing cadences. Time was moving, the formal schedule pressing its claims, and Calder Voss was still standing 2 feet from her, with her wrist in his hand and an expression on his face that she had last seen in the dreaming. He said her name, her true name, in the old tongue, with the specific inflection of the Voss bond acknowledgement that she had found described only in the oldest of the texts she had read, the inflection that meant recognized, claimed, mine in the way that forests are not owned, but are simply the place where a particular creature lives. She felt the root speak answer it like a bell struck after years of silence, clear, resonant, filling a space she had not known she had been holding empty. The scar on her wrist blazed once, bright as anything, and then settled into a warmth that was nothing like a wound and everything like a hearth fire in a room that has been shut up for too long and is finally receiving heat again. Her wolf, the deep silenced part of her, the part that had been muffled by renouncement and sustained by 12 patient years of quiet refusal to stop existing. Her wolf lifted her head. Mara let out a breath she had been holding for 12 years. The formal council session was convened that evening, at Calder's request, in the smaller chamber off the main hall. The council was 7 wolves, the senior representatives of the Western Territories, and their collective expression when Mara walked in behind the Alpha King was the particular expression of people who have been managing a tight and organized situation and have just watched an unexpected variable enter from an unexpected direction. She recognized that expression. She had been the unexpected variable before. She was considerably more comfortable with it now. Calder presented the Voss bloodline record with the precision of a man who had done his preparation on the short walk between chambers. He had, she realized, been running the administrative structures in parallel with the conversation all afternoon. The formal mind working its angles while the personal mind did the harder, less quantifiable work of recognition. It was, she thought, what high authority looked like when it was genuinely good at its function, both processes happening simultaneously, neither one compromising the other. The council listened. The eldest counselor, a woman with silver streaks in her dark hair and the bearing of a wolf who has sat in formal structures for decades, asked 3 pointed questions. Mara answered 2 of them directly, and the third with a counter-question that the eldest counselor received with a fractional lift at the corner of her mouth that was as close to approval as the formal context allowed. The renouncement record was retrieved, examined. The Voss bloodline provision was invoked. There was a period of formal deliberation that lasted approximately 12 minutes. And then the eldest counselor looked at Mara with the clear, measuring regard of a woman who has assessed many wolves in many contexts and arrives at conclusions without sentimentality. The renouncement is dissolved as improperly obtained under the Bloodline Protection Statute, she said. The blood designation is restored to the active register. Mara Voss, you are recognized by the Council of the Western Territories. Mara received this without expression, not from coldness. She felt it, deeply, the full impact of the formal words in the formal number, striking the 12-year edifice of her exile with a precision and completeness she had not let herself imagine. She felt it move through her the way the elder stone had moved through her at 17, low and inevitable and large. She let herself feel it fully, and she stood still while it moved through her, and she did not perform it for the room. After, in the corridor outside the chamber, Calder fell into step beside her. You didn't react, he said. Not a criticism, an observation from a man genuinely curious. I reacted, she said. I simply don't need you to see it to know it was real. He was quiet for a step or two. What does it feel like? She considered. Like breathing correctly for the first time in a long time, she said. You don't notice you've been breathing wrong until you stop. He stopped walking. She stopped with him. They were in the corridor between the formal chambers and the main hall, and the light was the warm amber of the assembly's evening session, and the hall sounds were a low, continuous murmur beyond the door. He turned to face her, and she turned to face him, and the root speak ran warm and clear between them, in the way it had been running since the afternoon, not demanding, not building toward anything, simply present, simply the deep structural magic, doing what deep structural magic does, which is to exist at the foundation of things and make the things above it more stable. The dreaming will change now, she said. It was not a question. I know, he said. I think it was always meant to be temporary, a signal, a navigation. A way of finding each other across a distance neither of us had the means to cross otherwise, she said. Yes. She looked at him. He looked at her. The silvery quality of his eyes was different in close proximity and in real light than it had been in the dreams, warmer, more complex, less monumental, and more simply itself, the eyes of a specific person rather than an archetype. She found she preferred this version. She found she preferred the real thing to the symbol of it, which was, she supposed, the point. I need to ask you something, she said. Ask. The South Territory disputes, the reason your betas thought the dreaming was stress. He tilted his head slightly, waiting. I want to know about your work, she said, not because I intend to insert myself into it without being asked, but because I've spent 12 years not knowing what was happening in the territories I was removed from, and I would like to understand the world I've come back into. All of it, not just the parts that are relevant to me. He was quiet for a moment then. The disputes are about a water corridor in the southern mountains, 3 pacts with overlapping claim lines and a treaty from 60 years ago that used boundary markers that no longer exist on the physical landscape. It's been arbitrating for 2 years. And the root speak, she said carefully. A wolf with the Voss root speak could theoretically. Yes, he said. She had not finished the sentence. He did not need her to. A wolf who can speak directly to the bond structure of the packs involved could potentially mediate at a level that formal arbitration cannot reach. His voice was carefully neutral. I want to be clear that this is not why. I know it isn't, she said. I felt the acknowledgement. I know the order of things. I'm raising it because it's mine to offer or not, and I'm choosing to offer it. Not because you need it from me, because it's what the gift is for. He looked at her for a long moment. It has been for a long time, she said. A gift with nowhere useful to go. I would like it to have somewhere to go. It will, he said, quiet and certain. They stood in the amber corridor, and the weight of the day settled around them. The recognition, the council chamber, the restored name, the root speak, running steady between 2 wolves who had found each other through 238 nights of dreaming and 12 years of a distance that had not, it turned out, been able to interrupt what was already written in the deep structure. Mara stood in her forest green dress with her wrist no longer covered, the scar visible against the warm light, and she felt her wolf settle in her chest in the way of a creature finally come home to a territory it had always known was its own. She had not come here expecting this. She had come here because the dreaming told her it was time, and because 12 years was enough, and because she had been made small long enough that the next large thing she encountered, she intended to stand level with it and not flinch. She had come prepared to be unseen, dismissed, insufficient. The exile with the forged documents and the second-hand dress standing at the wall of a room she had no standing to be in. She had come carrying all the architecture of a life built on careful smallness, and had been prepared, if necessary, to remain small inside it. Instead, the Alpha King's wolf had known her. Instead, the root speak had run between 2 Voss wolves for the first time in over a century, and the bond had opened like a door in a dark house, and the light had come through it. Instead, she was standing in a corridor with the restored weight of her name on her shoulders. Not the borrowed coat of it, not the formal administrative notation of it, but the actual living substance of it. The name her grandmother had spoken over her at birth, the name the elder stone had resonated with at 17, the name that had been stripped and stricken, and was now returned to her, not given, returned. Which was entirely different, because you give something that was yours to give, and you return something that was always theirs. It had always been hers. Every year of the exile had not altered that by a single degree. The renouncement had been improperly obtained under the bloodline protection statute, which meant it had been invalid from the moment it was signed, which meant that her name had never actually been taken. It had only been, temporarily, by those without the right, not spoken aloud. The root speak knew this, the mate bond knew it. The elder stone had known it when she was 17, and standing in the summer dark with the moon on her face. His wolf had known it from across a hall. Now he knew it too, and the knowing was in both of them. And the dreaming was already changing. She could feel it shifting even in wakefulness, the quality of the tether between them becoming something different from the searching signal of the previous 238 nights. No longer a compass pointing towards something not yet reached. Something arrived at, something that would henceforth be the fixed point, the one the compass did not point to, because you were already standing there. In the weeks and months that followed, and she would tell this story to herself in pieces over many years, the way you return to important landscapes not to understand them better, but simply to stand in them again. Mara Voss came to know the man behind the silver eyes with the gradual, layered intimacy of two wolves whose bond had been active far longer than their acquaintance. The dreaming did change. It became something quieter, less urgent, the sharp signal of searching replaced by the low warmth of presence, not the fire of crisis but the hearth fire of the habitual, the kind of warmth you stop noticing because you have stopped being cold. She moved south, not immediately, not without the careful deliberateness that 12 years had made fundamental to her way of moving through the world. She gave her landlady 3 months' notice. She ate the blackberry pie. She sat in the diner for a last long shift and looked at her co-workers with the specific affection of a woman who has been well kept by modest things for a long time and does not forget it when the large things arrive. She packed her 12 years of careful living into the back of her 12-year-old car, and she drove south through the Oregon autumn, the trees, all the colors of the season, and she did not look back with longing, because she had not left anything she was not bringing with her. What she brought was the 12 years themselves, not as a wound, not as a deficit, not as the evidence of what had been done to her, but as 12 years of becoming. She had become in the exile and the silence and the carefully constructed smallness exactly the wolf she needed to be for this. She had learned patience the hard way, and patience was the primary discipline of the root speak. She had learned to read structures that others dismissed as stable, to feel the load-bearing walls of a situation before any external sign of stress appeared. She had learned, which was perhaps the most important thing, to hold her own knowing without requiring external confirmation of it. Her knowing had been right. It had been right for 12 years. The exiles had not changed what she was. It had only changed where she was. The South Territory water corridor dispute was resolved the following spring in a mediation that the council would later describe in formal language as precedent-setting. Mara did not use the formal language in her own understanding of it. She used the root speak in the way she always used it, carefully, without performance, going to the foundational layer of the 3 Pax bonds and speaking to the structural tether that connected them to the land they disputed. She did not impose a resolution. She showed each pack through the bond structure, where the genuine claim lines ran. Not the lines on the 60-year-old treaty, but the older lines, the bone lines, the lines written in the specific attachment of wolf blood to specific earth that ran so deep and so old that no administrative document had ever fully captured them. The 3 packs had known where their actual boundaries were, the way bodies know their own contours, in a register below language. Mara simply made it audible. That was the root speak. That had always been the root speak. Not power in the theatrical sense, not the imposition of will, but the clarification of what was already true, the amplification of what the deep structure had always known. Calder had sat in the mediation chamber and watched her work, with the expression of a man encountering something he had been told was theoretical, and discovering that it is in fact operational, and rather more extraordinary in practice than in description. After he had told her this, straightforwardly, in the way she had already come to understand, was his natural mode, not elaborate with sentiment but direct with it, which she appreciated more than she had expected to, having spent 12 years in a world where directness was a luxury most people could not afford. It was like watching someone tune an instrument, he had said, except the instrument is several hundred years of territorial claim, and the tuning resolves a 2-year dispute in 4 hours. The instrument knew what it was supposed to sound like, she said. I only removed the interference. He had looked at her then with that specific quality she had come to know as his recognition face, not the dramatic recognition of the assembly hall, the large first moment, but the quieter recurring recognition of someone discovering over and over in small and specific moments that the person in front of them is exactly who they are. This happened frequently between them. She had stopped being surprised by it, and then she had stopped taking it for granted, and had landed somewhere in the middle, in the place where you simply receive a thing because it is real, and you do not need to qualify it. The Ashvale Pack's former alpha had, it emerged, known precisely what he was removing. The investigation that followed the restoration of Mara's standing, conducted by the Council investigative body, with Calder's formal request behind it, produced documentation showing that the renouncement had been deliberate and informed, that the elder who had looked away at the elder stone had submitted a private report to the Alpha, afterward confirming the Voss bloodline reading and the root speak manifestation, and that the Alpha's decision to renounce, rather than acknowledge, had been made on the basis of this information. He had known she was Voss. He had removed her because she was Voss, because a Voss bloodline wolf with the root speak, manifesting in a pack, without a Voss bloodline allegiance, was a structural liability he had preferred to eliminate rather than declare. Mara read the documentation once. She sat with it for a long time. She felt the anger that had been part of her structure for 12 years flare once, bright and clean, and then settle, not resolve into forgiveness. She was not interested in performing forgiveness for the comfort of observers, but settle into something that had the weight and finality of land after the water recedes, the ground that remains, what is left when the event is over. She did not attend the formal censure of the former Alpha. She did not need to be present for it to be real. Her name was in the register. The scar on her wrist was warm. The dreaming had given way to the thing the dreaming was pointing toward, which was simply being here. In the present tense, in her own name, in the life she was now building the way she had always built. Carefully, deliberately, with full knowledge of the load-bearing walls. Her wolf ran for the first time in 12 years. In early winter, on a night when the moon was full and the forest behind Calder's territory was deep with snow, and the world had gone very quiet in the way of worlds that are carrying something they do not yet want to put down. She ran in the wolf form, she had not been able to access since the renouncement, the form that came back to her, not as a stranger but as a mirror, the deep part of herself that the muffling had concealed, which had been there the whole time, and which was, she discovered, exactly as she remembered it except larger, more present, more itself, as she had become. Calder ran with her. Their bond was fully open, the root speak conducting between them, like a conversation with no need of words, and the deep winter forest received them both without ceremony, because the land did not require ceremony for the acknowledgement of things that were simply true. They ran, and the snow came down, and the moon was overhead, and the scar on her wrist was warm and steady, and finally, nothing but itself. Not a wound, not a signal, not a message from an unacknowledged bond, but the mark of what she had always been, carried into the life she had always belonged to. She had not been given it back. She had claimed it in a forged green dress and a borrowed name and a rented motel room, in the courage of a woman who had been made small for 12 years and had refused to be reduced by it. She had claimed it with quiet certainty of the root speak, and the level gaze in the mirror, and the drive south, through the autumn trees, and the decision, made alone and without external support, to stand at the eastern wall of a great hall and be found. The Alpha King's wolf had known before he did, but she had always known. She had known, from the first night the dreaming came, from the first warmth in the scar, from the first moment the deep structure of the bond had hummed against her ribs, and the deep, silenced, patient part of her had lifted her head and said, without drama, without flourish, with all the unhurried certainty of a thing that has been true for 12 years, and has simply been waiting for the world to catch up. Yes, that one I know, him. I have known him. Bring me home.